Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon to all of you. Our today's session is about active learning and effective questioning techniques. And our honorable guest speaker is Ms. Hadia Shaukat. She has worked in education sector for the past 7 years in various capacities in the private and development sector. Most of her career has been spent as a teacher trainer in various organizations, including Beaconhouse and Care Foundation, where she organized and managed professional development for teachers. The main areas of interest in which she has conducted training are active learning, assessment for learning, reflective practices, and classroom management. So over to you, Ms. Adya.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kaya, for such a nice introduction. Hello, everyone. I can see a lot of people in the session. So hi, hello, Aksa, Hina, Middat, Mustafa, and everybody else too, whose name I couldn't take. So first, let's just move on right into the session because Mr. Kaya has already given us a very nice introduction here. Just wait a second. Yeah. So, I was about to begin the session by my introduction, but as Mr. Kaya has already, elaborated on that, so I would want you to, use the chat box and just give a little introduction about yourself. So, like, from which schools do you belong to? What subjects are you taking? And maybe the grade level. So, it will just give me an idea of the audience that I'm conducting the session with, and I will, have my examples in the session planned accordingly. So just take a few seconds and use the chat box to give me a detail of like from which schools you are, what subjects are you taking, preferably if you're taking any specific grade level as well. Okay, so Kuritilan is from Foundation Public School, great. Sophia is taking global perspectives, grade 9, 10, and 11 in Siddharth School. Okay, Aksa is taking English language, great. So yeah, we do have a lot of variety in this session, and that is exactly what I was looking for, so that we can have examples and questions from different grades and different subject areas. So in order to begin with the session, what I would like you to do is that I'm going to display a question here on the screen. Okay, I don't know. Yeah. So can you all see this question? So I want you to take 2 minutes and I want you to think about this question. Like if you could choose any person from history to be your imaginary friend, who would it be and why? So just take 2 minutes, think about the question, and then you can use the chat box. And if any of you wants to, unmute themselves and want to answer, wants to volunteer and answer, you can even do that as well. But just take a second, take a minute and think about this question and then, write down the answer in the chat box. Or if there anyone who wants to answer like verbally as well, I'm more than happy to take that. Okay, Aksa says Frank Kafka to read all his work. Friends, yeah. Great. Okay. Newton. Okay. Muhammad Ali Jinnah. Okay, so you need to focus on the question as well. So it says who would it be and why as well. So can we just get like any volunteer who wants to like, share his or her thoughts with us? Rumi. Okay, Shella says Rumi. Great. Okay. And why, Shella, why do you want to be like, Rumi? Mustafa says Bill Gates. Okay. Okay, so Sophia says Nelson Mandela because the man who brought change in the world. I would love to know all the what's, whys, and hows from him. So great, Sophia. So let's just like take a minute and think about like when I posed this question to you, what did this do to you? Like what did come to your mind and what were you thinking about this? So when just in perspective of your student as well. So when you are the teacher and you are asking questions, what is happening in students' mind? Yeah, so there's a thought process in progress. Yeah. So imagine yourself as a student and think about what's happening to your mind when I'm asking you the question. You can raise your hands and just, I'll let anybody who raises their hand, I'll let them speak. Yeah, critical thinking, deep thinking, great. What else? Okay, Sophia says she was thinking that which person should she choose, as there are so many people I would want to meet and have a conversation with. Yeah, great. So basically, it was, letting you to think, it was letting you to reflect, because it was also letting you to reflect on why do you want to be that person. It was making you focused. Yeah, Shella quickly says, has rightly pointed out this. So when we pose questions to our students, we are actually forcing them to think, and not only think, but also reflect on their thinking as well. So we are forcing them to reflect on their cognitive processes, and that is why it's very important the way we put our questions rightly turn out. They need to be rightly turned out, and they need to be rightly planned out for our students according to their learning needs. And that is exactly what we are going to do in today's session as well. I'll share my learning objectives here. So this is why the questions we ask are really important, because firstly it probes thought process. So when I was asking you question, I was actually forcing you to think about it. And then secondly, in case of our we posing questions to our students, we pose them problems, we challenge them, we ask them to reflect on critical issues, and we want them eventually to enhance their student learning. So what happens is that it's a process that has to be followed. So from probing, their thought process, to posing them problems, to challenging, their thinking, and to enabling them to reflect and then enhance their student learning. So we often, think of questions as a subject which is very simple, and we as teachers, think about it like it is something that we have an expertise on. But yet the research shows that questions is one of the most is one area which has been most problematic, and ones which needs the most development on for the teachers. So in today's session, what we are actually going to do is that we first are going to identify the purposes of classroom questioning. We are going to analyze some types of questions that are frequently used in our scenario, and then we are going to move on to exploring effective questioning techniques. So what I want you to do is that we are going to I want you to list down 5 questions that you ask your students during your lessons, and you might be having paper or a pen. You just don't need to share it with me. You only need to write it down for yourself, and then we are going to use these questions for the rest of the session. So, a tip is that you can select a subject. For example, somebody here was taking GP. So, according to your topic area, your subject area, just write down 5 questions which you are most frequently asking your students. And you don't have to think about creating higher order or lower order questions. You only have to think about the kind of questions that you are asking. So, there's nothing right or wrong in that. We are just going to use these questions for the rest of the session. And if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask me. Okay, so just take a minute and write it down. And when you're done, so just write in the chat box that you've completed it. Okay, done. We'll wait for a couple of others to be completed, and then we'll move on. Done. 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 Okay, great. So I'm assuming that a lot of people are done here. So, I'm going to show you a little video here, and then we're going to, have a discussion on it. Can you all see the video?
Yes, we can, but it's not playing, Miss Hadia.
Yeah, I'm going to play it. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Miss, the sound is not audible.
It's not?
No, it's not.
Okay, I'll just, share it from here. Just give me a second. Can you hear it now?
No, miss.
No, miss.
Okay. Don't know. Okay, just give me a second. Please let me know when you can hear it.
Okay.
Can you hear it?
No.
No? Okay. Can I send the link to any one of you and you can try to play it, Mr. Kaya?
Mr. Kaya is not here right now. I am the moderator here, miss.
Okay. I'll send the link in the chat.
You can share the screen again and there'll be an option. Click on share sound and yeah, just click on that and share. You can share it again. You can try that.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
Further creative thinking and creativity in their classes. They wanted to address the claim that their students were mostly rote learners. And as the claim goes, that beyond the memorization of facts and figures,
I'll play it from here.
I am a professional teacher evaluator. For the past 15 years, I've been traveling throughout the United States and China, trying to answer the not so easy question of how do we make our teachers better. And on a series of recent school visits here in China, school leaders asked me how their teachers could further creative thinking and creativity in their classes. They wanted to address the claim that their students were mostly rote learners. And as the claim goes, that beyond the memorization of facts and figures, their students really didn't have the opportunity to put this knowledge to use outside of the classroom. Now, they've heard that in the West, their Western counterparts have smaller classes. Maybe there is more opportunities for group interaction. And students there have an opportunity to pursue topics that are of genuine interest to them. And so school leaders are now looking for ways to inject new teaching methodologies into the Chinese classroom. And as a teacher evaluator, there are certain things that I look for whenever I observe a class. One thing that I look for in particular are the types of questions that teachers ask. Questions are a way of bringing the textbook material to life. They're a way of directly engaging the students and making sure that the students stay on task. They're also a way to check for understanding, to make sure that the students are actually absorbing what they're supposed to be learning. But not all questions are created equally. Take a look at this pair of questions here. The first one, question A, reads, "Do you know what climate change is?" And the second one, question B, reads, "What are 3 causes of climate change?" Now, which one of these questions better assesses student learning? If you said B, you're right. Question B requires you to possess a specific type of knowledge in order to answer this question. Either you have this information or you don't. And so let's go ahead, and this time we'll add another question into the mix. Take a look at question C. Why do some claim that climate change is the biggest crisis facing this generation? Now, which one of these better assesses student learning? Well, this question may be a little more difficult than the previous one because they both can. And so the former assesses student knowledge, while the latter gives students an opportunity to think of the consequences of an impending disaster. And so in the ideal class, students would first ask, or teachers rather, would first ask question B to establish the foundation knowledge. And then they would ask question C to give students an opportunity to use this knowledge. Now, think back to when you guys were in school, and I know for many of us this may be a difficult, painful experience. But think for a second if your teacher only asked you questions like question B. Well, this might be great for trivia contests, but we would never get an opportunity to use or put this knowledge to good use. And think about for a second if your teacher only asked you questions like question C, and these are pretty difficult questions. This might serve to frustrate your learning, and maybe you'd be tempted to give up before you even get started. Now, back to the observations. I went on these teacher observations recently, and we saw different classes, but I noticed that there was something in particular that was lacking. And while the teachers were certainly well prepared, and there was a lot of engagement going on in the classes, an overwhelming 90% of the questions that were asked were of lower order question types. In other words, they looked more like question B. And in 3 of those classes, not one single higher order question was even asked. And so, how does this even happen? Well, asking higher order questions is the key to stimulating critical thinking. And we need to be able to give students an opportunity to grapple with questions that don't necessarily have one correct answer. This is more realistic of the types of situations that they're likely to face when they get outside of the classroom. Now, teachers shouldn't have to bear the responsibility.
Okay, so I would just like you to focus on the points that he was suggesting in the video. That most of us tend to focus on lower order questions, either lower order thinking questions or on higher order thinking skills questions. But ideally in the situation, can any of you just point out that what kinds of questions should we be asking? Referring to the video, you can just use the chat box. Like ideally, what kind of questions should we be asking our students? A blend of both, Kurutalan, yeah, great.
I think more of probing questions where we can find out what the students think. And I'm also basing most of this on the nature of my subject. So,
yeah, and what are you teaching?
Global perspectives.
Okay, great. So you are saying that we need to be asking them probing questions. Yeah, that's exactly what we need to be doing in global perspectives. What else? Like I would like to listen from some other people as well from a different subject area. Can you see my presentation?
Yes, yes, it's clear.
Yeah. Okay, so Syed Istisham is saying that questions that promote learning. Great. So, as it was pointed out in the video, that we need to, have a blend of both questions where we have higher order question as well and the lower order question as well. And that actually brings us to the purposes of question, that why questions are important and why do we need to ask them and what actually do they do. So, the research highlights that questions are used for different purposes. Some of these purposes are active learning, critical thinking and reflection, formative assessment. So, what is active learning? Active learning is when the students are actively engaged in the construction of their knowledge, when they are able to make connections with their prior knowledge, and when they are able to, connect their understanding to the new content that we are teaching them. And how do you think that active learning can take place in classes? We when we are trying to think about active learning, we think about activities like group work, peer work. We think about project work. We think about giving out reflections to them. But what we tend to often neglect is that the simplest way of engaging students in constructing their own knowledge is to ask them questions, questions that probe them, questions them, a question that encourages them to reflect on their learning, questions them that promotes analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. And that is one purpose of active of questioning out there. And the second purpose is critical thinking and reflection. So can anybody just, quickly write down in the chat box, what does critical thinking mean? So what do you mean by critical thinking? I've already displayed it now. So basically critical thinking is about identification. The students are able to identify concepts, and then they're not only able to identify concepts, but they're also able to analyze them. Analysis means that they're able to compare different components. They're able to compare different theories they are studying. They're able to compare different concepts they are studying, and then they're able to reflect on them as well. And after reflection, they're even able to evaluate, and they're able to reason, they provide to reasoning. So they're moving beyond from just identification of concepts and description of concepts to more sound analysis, reflection, and evaluation. And this will obviously, when you see the cycle, I think it will bring Bloom's taxonomy in your mind, and the different levels which will obviously move on to in our next slides as well. So one of the major purposes of questioning is to enhance critical thinking skills in students, and 21st century skills. The research is highlighting the 21st century skills are very important for students in the future to even get jobs, and critical thinking is one major component there. And the way you design your questions can really impact their critical thinking skills. And these active learning and critical thinking skills were with the perspective of students, but from the perspective of teachers as well, I think questions are a very important tool for the formative assessment. So is there anybody here who is aware of what formative assessment is? You can either unmute yourself or you can just use the chat box. What comes to your mind when you think of this word formative assessment?
It's assessment for learning, which we take during a lesson, on spot evaluation of how much the students are grasping from what we're teaching them.
Yeah, so it's an ongoing assessment. It's an assessment of what students are able to grasp, and what it helps you is that you can change your teaching methodology and teaching processes accordingly. So questioning is one of the major tools for that, where you can assess where your learner is, where you want them to go, and how can you also enable them to reach what the goals you have established. So, when we often think of questions, we often focus on critical thinking and active learning, but we forget about formative assessment as well, that one of the easiest and most simplest tool that you can use even in last 10 seconds of your class is to ask them questions. So, let's just do that little activity. In the beginning of the session, I asked you to write down 5 questions, right? So now think about it, take a minute, and can you just classify them according to purposes shared? So we shared 3 purposes here. One was active learning, one was critical thinking, and the other was formative assessment. So now you have written 5 questions for yourself. Can you classify each question according to the purpose that it is assessing? And then I would like to hear from one of the volunteers. Share their questions and classify them according to the purposes. Either you're using that question for active learning, which is engaging students, either you're using the question for enhancing their critical thinking skills about the topic, for example, in GP, or either you're using that question to assess where the students are. So just take a minute. So let me know when you're done. Okay, so like, are we done for this? Can I have one volunteer who would like to share the kind of questions they had written and what category do they belong to? Sophia, do you want to take a shot at it?
Yeah, sure. I just felt that I'm the only one speaking. So the questions that I wrote, they're mostly for active learning and critical thinking, as I said earlier, because I want to probe my students as to whenever they're sharing something, or even if it's a fact or an opinion of their own or a global perspective. So I'd like to ask what their thinking or their own opinion about that matter is, what their stance is. Also, I want them to give a reason why a country has this particular perspective, or the entire world has this particular perspective. So I would say it will be active learning and critical thinking. So they fall under that.
Yeah. And all these questions are actually can also fall in the formative assessment as well. So when you're asking them questions about, their understanding of the content, you're actually assessing their understanding, and it can help you in shaping your lesson accordingly, and, in designing your assignments, questions, and lesson plans accordingly. So for example, if you're asking them a question, you are, trying to understand that where they are in terms of their understanding of the content for GP, and you can just check it out that whether students are going on the right direction or not, and if not, then you change your teaching strategies accordingly, right, Sophia? So I think you already must be doing that, but it's very important to classify the purposes of your question. When designing the questions, you need to be very specific about what the purpose is. Either it's for active learning, engaging them, either it is for critical thinking, or either you're going to use that question to assess student understanding. So we'll move on, and we're going to move on towards the kind of questions. So what kind of questions are there? Like, you can use the chat box, and we'll also quickly move on to the types of questions that there are. So the research shows that actually teachers ask around 300 to 400 questions, in a day with their students, and that they do not stick only to one kind of questions. In fact, they are asking like a variety of questions. So what these questions actually are. So let's just watch this video, and let me know if you can hear it or not.
So, some of the people who wanted to talk to us weren't able to be here, but they were happy for a small part of their thinking to be captured on video. So first up is Lucy Crehan, best described as an education explorer. Having taught in the UK for 3 years and completed a Master's in Education at Cambridge, Lucy set out to work in schools and live with teachers in top-performing education systems around the world. We've captured some of her thoughts on questioning styles from a few of those countries.
I was in China, I did notice that the way in which teachers ask questions. So you had those kind of closed, yes, no, single answer questions, but you also had some really open or in-depth questions. And that won't surprise anyone. You know, that's just good teaching practice. Teachers do that in England as well. The difference, I think, was when you use those different sorts of questions. So in the first couple of grades, teachers will do quite a lot of closed questioning. Children will do quite a lot of memorization of number facts. And that's important. You know, research has shown that memorizing certain key components of any discipline is really important. What they also did, though, when children got a little bit older in the next couple of years, was really ask more in-depth questions, more open questions, to get children to make connections between different parts of the subject. A student might give an answer to a question, fairly straightforward question that the teacher has asked, to some kind of closed question. If they got it wrong, all right, to be honest, the teacher, rather than just moving on and saying yes or no, would ask often another follow-up question to that student. So they might say, okay, that's interesting. What strategy did you use, or how did you get that? And then not only building on that answer with that student, but then asking a different student in the class, oh, how did you do it? Do you agree? What different strategies did you use to get this same answer? So in that way, really getting students to think more deeply about the ways in which they were coming up with particular answers. Research comparing Chinese and American teachers has shown that Chinese teachers are much more likely to ask follow-up questions when a student gets something wrong, rather than saying, no, that's not right, or good try, and telling the student the answer. That's actually really important for learning, because then not only does the student know that they've got the answer right or wrong, but they understand why they got the answer right or wrong. Many people think that in Finland, it's all about student group work and student-led learning. And actually, surprisingly, in Finland, the teachers do quite a lot of whole class teaching. But the way in which they do that is quite interesting, because it's certainly not the teacher standing at the front just talking for the whole lesson. It is reasonably teacher-centered, but the teacher will ask a lot of questions and generate a class discussion. So again, it's not just about the teacher asking a student a question and the student responding. It's about the teacher taking a student's response and actually asking other students to build on that, leading into a whole class conversation. So another great practice in questioning I noticed in my studies abroad is the way in which teachers used what we in England call hinge questions. So that's the use of a question at a certain point in the lesson to try and get a sense of what the students have understood, what their misconceptions are, so they know at that point in time whether to carry on with a certain topic or address a misconception, or whether actually most of the class have got it and they can move on. The crafting of these questions is really important. You know, getting a question where if a student gets the answer right, you know that it's because they have understood that concept, rather than just they haven't understood it but they could still by chance get it right. So the kind of questioning that teachers are using in Finland is always genuinely to get a sense of, have the students understood it? Where are they? It's entirely for learning, because the summative piece is done by the teacher themselves. And that is actually, you know, the kind of questions which are formative are helping the teachers to have an understanding of where the student is, helping them get as far as they can before they have to give them an overall assessment or test. In a study by Stigler and Stevenson, this is back some years ago now, they went into Japan and they looked at the practice of lesson study, which is where a number of teachers come together to plan a lesson together. And they said, well, what do you spend all of that time talking about? And one of the teachers said, well, we spent a lot of time thinking about what question to ask, because the right question can really get students thinking about a subject, or the right question can really get us to understand where students have gone wrong. And that is such a powerful tool. So it's not the case that a single teacher's coming up with it. It's a group of teachers, or it's a question. In Singapore, for example, they have teachers' guides, and it'll be a question in the teacher's guide, which has previously been thought of meticulously and thought about and discussed by expert teachers. The ideal amongst Japanese teachers is to start the lesson with some kind of problem that they ask the students. So they might have a number of different glass containers, different shapes and sizes on the table, and the question will be, how can we tell which one holds the most water? And then the reason that they do that is to use that as a hook, so to get the students interested in, I don't know. we'll have to find out, what will be a different way to find out? And then the teacher can lead a whole sequence of questions and practicals potentially on the idea of measurements or the idea of volume. At a secondary level though, in year 9 in Japan, they are much more likely to be asking questions that are in those final assessments and giving feedback such as, learn this, it's in the exam.
Yeah. So it was pointed out in the video as well that there are different kinds of questions, from open-ended to closed-ended to hinged questions. There are all sorts of questions that teachers do ask, and it actually depends on you and your learners. So it's very important for you to analyze your learners and then ask them questions appropriately, because you have seen in the video that there are the students in Finland very different from students in Japan and very different from the students in the rest of the places in the world. So, and that is why their teachers are asking them very different kinds of questions. So when you are asking your students questions, you have to analyze that which situation you are in and what are your learners and what are their needs. So the kind of questions that you can be asking your students are either open or closed-ended, like she elaborated in the video as well. So open-ended, closed-ended questions are also called the polar questions. So now what are these polar questions? These polar questions are basically questions which either have an answer yes or no, or either you're asking them a multiple choice question and they only have to select one answer in that. So for example, if are asking somebody like would you like tea or coffee, or did you go for a drive, or either if you are asking them a multiple question to highlight which is the largest province in Pakistan. So those kinds of questions are all closed, as opposed to open-ended questions. These are the questions which require a little more thought, and they are generally, they encourage wider discussion and elaboration. So for example, if you are asking students that what do you think are different reasons for the recent issue of smog in Lahore, so that is an open question, and students can give their different opinions and give their different answers to it. Do we have a hand raised here? I saw Ali. Did you raise your hand? Okay, no, I think that was by mistake. So then we have divergent and convergent questions. So divergent questions are again very similar to open-ended questions. So these questions are the ones which actually require students to think about the content that is being taught to them, and there is no right or wrong answers, but it actually encourages exploration of possibilities. So for example, if you are asking your students if they are stuck on a desert, or for example they're stuck on an island and they only have few tools left with them, how can they come up with a solution to get out of that situation? So that is a very divergent question in which students will have their different opinions. Students can come up with different solutions, and there is no right and wrong as such in that question. But then there are some convergent questions as well. So these convergent questions actually encourage students to bring together ideas and knowledge from 2 or more fields and then synthesize them and develop them to generate a common logical answer. So for example, if you are an English teacher and you're asking them to come up with the main theme of a paragraph or a passage, so that is kind of a convergent question where you're asking students to come up with the theme and you are letting students to come to a common theme, and most of the students are going to arrive to that common idea. So that is kind of a convergent question. So we have some more kind of questions as well, which the research has highlighted and which relate to Bloom's taxonomy as well. So those are factual questions. Now we might often assume that factual questions are not very important because they are just, asking for facts. So for example, you might ask them, what are the number of provinces in Pakistan? How many rivers are there? So all of these kinds of questions are factual questions, but they are actually very important because they help you understand that where does your student stand, where does your learner stand in terms of the prior knowledge of the subject. Then there are questions like application questions where you get students to analyze relationships. So in what you have been teaching them, you ask them to apply their learning in these application questions. And then there are the connective and causal, effect questions where they can link their material, where they can link their concepts. So for example, the example I earlier gave about what do you think is causing pollution in Pakistan, is causing smog in Lahore these days. That is the kind of a question which is generating a cause and effect, relationship. And why, if you're an economics teacher, you can ask them like, why do you think that when the price of the product increases, the demand decreases? So it's kind of a relationship of cause and effect that is going to be tested in these kinds of questions. Then there are comparative questions, so that require comparisons between different concepts and theories. So for example, if you're a history teacher, you might be asking your students to analyze different historical, movements and compare them in terms of their key characteristics and features. So that is where, the comparative questions come in. And then finally, there is the evaluative question, and one of the qualities of these evaluative questions is that they make students reach the higher order thinking skills, where they come up with a response and you can further probe them. So for example, if a student if you ask a student a question that, do you think there should be curfews on youngsters these days? So they'll give an opinion, and then you can further probe them that, why do you think there should be curfew on teenagers? Yes. If they're answering yes, you can ask them, why do you think there should be? And if they're answering no, why do you think that there shouldn't be any, restrictions? So let's just, do a quick exercise again. Remember the questions that we wrote down in the starting of the sessions. Now I want you to classify according to the types of questions we just went in our slides. If you want, I can go over these slides again. I want you to classify them either closed-ended, open-ended, divergent, convergent, factual, evaluative, comparative. Just go over your questions and try to, categorize those questions into these different types of questioning. And Etihan is asking that, are there any guidelines on how to make our questions more targeted and appropriate? And yes, we are going to cover that by the end of the session today. And while you're doing that, I would just like one volunteer to, share their response, like how have they classified their questions? Anybody, you can just raise your hands, unmute yourself and start speaking. So Mustafa, do you want to share? How have you classified them? Anybody who wants? Yeah, go on.
Hello.
Yes.
Are we doing? Is this like how we classify questions as open or close-ended?
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, for example, some of my questions to my students. I'm a maths teacher, so if I will ask them, so is 2 minus 5 the same as 5 minus 2? So
yeah.
Depending on their question answer, yes or no, then you can build on to the next question, like, okay, why do you think it's the same, or why do you think it's not the same? So that this way, they can demonstrate
their
understanding.
So that's kind of evaluative question as well. Yeah, so where you're asking them and then you're probing them further. Great. So if other people want to share, they can just use the chat box for that. So now just let's move on to actually, defining what techniques you can use in order to make your questioning more targeted and, like Etisham was saying, more effective for our students. So for that, we'll be going over effective questioning techniques. I don't know why this PPT keeps on getting stuck. Just give me a second. Yeah. So the very first technique is always to use Bloom's taxonomy. So I'm even if you're not aware of what Bloom's taxonomy is, here is a quick overview of it. That Bloom's actually classified the cognitive processes of students thinking into several categories, starting from the very basic one, from the remembering, where students just recall what they know, to understanding, where they're able to explain what they have learned, to applying, to practically applying what they have learned with the help of examples or practical demonstrations, to analyzing, where they are able to compare their understanding of the content of a certain theory, of a certain topic, with other concepts, and then finally to moving to more higher order thinking skills, where they're evaluating and where they're actually creating, so where they're able to use all of their knowledge into a different scenario and come up with different solutions. So Bloom classified remembering, understanding, and applying as lower order thinking skills, and analyzing, evaluating, and creating as higher order thinking skills. So how can you use Bloom's taxonomy to help yourself? So, there's a lot of literature available online as well, and you can find this Bloom's taxonomy verb wheel anywhere available easily online, where they have, classified the Bloom's taxonomy, but then they have provided a suitable list of verbs that goes around with each level of cognitive development. So, for example, the kind of verbs you can use with remember and question the students accordingly. So these are the verbs. So, for example, you can ask students to list some of the things they know. You can ask them to label. You can ask them to identify. But whatever verb you're using, and whatever level of cognition you are in, either you have to remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, create, you have to go back to your learning objectives. So all of us kind of plan our lesson plans, where we set our learning objectives. While we are writing our learning objectives, then we have to carefully design our questions accordingly. Like, either we are aiming our students to remember the stuff, either we want our students to be able to paraphrase or describe the content, or either we want some sort of application where they are able to build up on the knowledge, where they're able to solve, or either we want them to go towards higher order thinking skills, where they're able to categorize, where they're able to critique, where they're able to create. So whatever level of learning objective you're aiming to achieve, you can use this verb wheel to plan your questions accordingly. So it kind of really gives you those words, those verbs that you can use in order to design your questions. And there's one suggestion, that always plan your questions ahead. And obviously there are some questions जो आपको उसी moment में आते हैं, and you have to go about as the flow of your session is going on, your class is going on, but always prepare some questions ahead, because that will give you a room and space to innovate a lot in the class. So after that, the first strategy you can use is wait time. So, the research says that, can anybody just take a guess and, answer the question that on average, teachers only wait how many seconds after asking a question before taking an answer from a learner? So, kitna time lete honge teachers before they answer their question themselves? Okay, 10 seconds?
10 seconds. Yeah.
Okay.
10 to 15 seconds.
So 10 to 15 seconds. Well,
Yeah.
you will be surprised, by the way, to hear that teachers only wait on average 1.5 seconds before they answer their own questions. So they put the question right to the students, and then they answer it on their own 1 to 5 seconds में. But ideally the research says कि आपको 3 to 5, or even there are some researchers which says 7 seconds आपको ideally wait करना चाहिए before you are answering your question yourself. And even in that moment, you should be trying to probe your students with further questions. Like, even if they are not able to answer that question, probe them further so that they're able to reach that question. So this is one of a lot of you might think that it is a very simple strategy, but trust me, this requires a lot of practice and a lot of patience as well, because sometimes when we are training as well, what we do is that we pose a question to the participants, and then quickly we want an answer from them. But at least try to wait 5 to 7 seconds. Then you have to stage and you have to sequence. So all the videos that we watched today, they very certainly made a point that you have to sequence your questions. So they have to begin from lower order thinking skills to higher order thinking skills. So for asking questions on the Bloom taxonomy of what, identifying, then gradually moving to analysis and comparison. Because what we do is that, because हमने इतनी research पढ़ी होती है, हमने इतना trainings भी ली होती हैं, where there's so much focus on higher order thinking skills that we go to our classes and we ask them questions about why, how, but we forget to ask them very basic questions. So for each and every lesson, your questions should be staged and structured in such a way that you start from the lower order thinking skills, as we mentioned in the Bloom's taxonomy, and then gradually move towards higher order thinking skills. Because, you know, one of the points that Brian in the video was also making, that we either tend to focus on one side of the question, but actually there is no perfect formula, and it always has to be a combination of questions that you should be asking your students. And then probing. So, you know, this is a very, very important thing that you have to do as a teacher, and, you know, when you are designing questions as well, that the research has proven out it to be one of the most effective techniques in questioning it in itself, that when you are asking questions and you are taking answers, don't just stop there. Probe them further. Ask them, why do they think? Why did they select? For example, even if in MCQs you can ask them that why did they select this particular option for this question. So try to explore their reasoning and try to explore, you know, the level of thought process they are applying. And probing actually helps a lot. You know, even for even like we do a lot of it for younger kids, but it helps a lot even at, you know, higher levels as well. And then reflection. So this is one thing which is very important as you know, teachers. What we need to be doing is that we often stop our questions when we get an answer, and, you know, we might probe them a little bit further, but we never ask them that, you know, if they've come up with something, what is an alternative approach to it? How would they go about doing things differently? Or how will you use what you have learned in the future? So, you know, making their learning more relevant for them. So the questions of how, you know, using their learning and applying it to their you know, current situation or in future, so that they are able to reflect on their own learning. So it's very important to develop our learners as reflective practitioners themselves. So we often think of teachers, you know, and we often think of people working in the education that they are the ones, you know, who are the reflective practitioners, but actually the aim of education is to develop our students to reflect on their own learning. So, you know, one of the techniques is that use a lot of questions which require reflection on the part of the students. Then, you know, and this is also like, you know, research shows that this is one technique which is taken for very granted, that, you know, we tend to not respond student answers positively, because, you know, even like somebody was sharing कि अगर आपका maths है और आप उनको मतलब कह रहे हो कि ये plus और ये minus होना है, and obviously there is one right answer to it, and if you're not getting it, it might get frustrating for you. But the, you know, the skill for you as a teacher is that how to take a yes or no answer, a right or wrong answer, and then positively respond towards it, even if you know that the student is not, you know, understanding the concept and is not answered in the right manner. You always as teachers have to respond to their questions and answers very positively. And, you know, another area that the research has shown and has worked very effectively is acknowledgement and praise. So this leads back again to, you know, probing and reflection and everything, that you have to praise your students, because this is what is, you know, will come ahead, and how it is linked into what I'm going to present in the next slide as well, that the ultimate goal of your teaching and learning is, and your, you know, the session on questioning as well, is not only to make you good questionnaires, but also you have to you know, make your students to become the key questionnaires. So your aim is to make your students, you know, reflect in such a way that they are able to, you know, start developing questions for themselves. So by the end of your, you know, a year-long session with them, you are asking them less questions and they are asking you more questions. So you are not the only one who needs to be asking questions in the class. And if you are the one who is asking the majority of the questions in the class, like, you know, I quoted a research where they said that the teachers ask 300 to 400 questions in a day, then there is something that is going on wrong, because your students are asking less questions. So, you know, you have to train your students on how to, you know, ask questions related to higher order thinking skills, how, why, to ensure that they're not only understanding, but they're also, you know, questioning their thinking as well. So this kind of, you know, brings us to this summary, actually, that how, you know, this is a little roadmap that you can use to make sure that you are going on the right track. So first of all, you know, it's very important to plan your questions ahead. Either they're of an academic nature, either they're of a reflective nature, then you have to phrase them. And, you know, phrasing is very important, because the kind of phrasing of the question you do, it will develop that either your students are going to reflect towards higher order thinking skills or lower order thinking skills, and then sequence them accordingly. Obviously, you cannot plan all the questions you're going to ask in the class, but you can plan some of the questions and keep them in front of you so that you have some guidelines. Then you allow them for the wait time, and we've already discussed that, and you stage questions from lower order thinking skill to higher order thinking skills. And then once you're asking them questions, you need to acknowledge them, you need to praise them, you need to respond to their questions positively. And then if you keep on doing these things, research highlights that you will actually get your students comfortable enough so that they are able to ask you questions, and they are asking questions and you are asking less of the questions. So are we clear up till now here, or do we need is there anything which is not clear? So then, I know that we're already on time, so I'll quickly wrap it up, the session for you. So to conclude, what I need you to do is that remember, we have been using these 5 questions from the very beginning. I want you to categorize according to the Bloom's taxonomy level that we did, and think of 2 strategies of how you can effectively incorporate these questions in your classroom. So just take 2 minutes and think about the questions you have written and identify on the level of Bloom's taxonomy that they correspond to, and then think of also 2 strategies of how you can effectively incorporate these questions in your classroom. If you want, I can go back to the Bloom's taxonomy chart. Yeah. You can use this, and you can see where your questions are lying, and think of 2 strategies you can come up with when asking questions to students. And I would like to have 1 volunteer at least to, yeah, somebody has raised their hand. I can't see the hand. Yeah, so Muhammad Abid, do you want to share?
Yes, ma'am.
जी, करें आप शेयर बताएं. Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, actually, I'm late. Actually, I just joined it a bit late. I was there in school leadership session with Muzaffar, somebody like that. So I'm so sorry, actually. So I couldn't get, but okay. Actually, I will evaluate. I will give opportunity to my students to evaluate themselves with the, in this one way, like whatever they're reading at the moment. And afterwards, the questions of the exercise will be asked to each other, and they will check each, they will counter question each other in one way or the other to find out whether they are right or wrong as far as answers are concerned, like that.
Okay, great. Okay, we'll take the next response from Roshan. You have also raised your hand, Roshan Ara.
Ma'am, I want to ask you how many minutes should I speak in my class in order to use this analogy, whatever you're talking about, or how many minutes should students speak in the class in one session?
Yeah, okay, so actually there is no fixed criteria of how much should you lecture and how much students should be engaged. So it's a very relative idea, depending upon sometimes you have to teach them a very important concept in maths, for example. So you're telling the students of some very important trigonometrical concepts, so maybe there you will have to speak more, right? But for example, in a subject like GP, where the teacher can only, give some sort of introduction in the very first few minutes, and then the rest of the entire class could be based on discussion. So it actually varies from subject to subject and to your content knowledge as well. But mostly what, ideally should be that your students should be actively engaged. And for that, you will have to be questioning. So you cannot just go about, 40 minutes lecturing the students, especially in a classroom level. So you will be asking questions to them, but obviously it will depend upon like what is your objective at the end of the day, what you want to achieve. So for example, अगर आपने उनको कुछ maths में अभी introduce किया है and आपने उनको करके दिखाना है, so maybe you will be the one talking a lot. But then if you have to check their application in the next session, then it will be mostly students who should be, leading the class. And I
Right.
hope that kind of.
I deal with grammar, English language, IGCSE English, so I will be using the verb form as you said, making the questions clear to students in a very simple manner, so they're going to be able to understand me as soon as possible. And in this way, really, they can respond back to me in a very good manner, and that's good. Then.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think speech quality, like I can give them chance to come forward and speak a little bit, 1 minute every student. Whatever they have learned in a class is going to be okay, man. This is going to be good strategy, I think.
Yeah, that can be good strategy. Any other, thank you so much, Mohammed. And any other volunteer do we have who wants to share their categorization and their strategy? Before we wrap up the session, I can see the chat box. People are saying mine are mostly in understanding and creative. My questions are mostly in apply and evaluate. My questions are in, so mostly people, are on evaluating, remembering, and analyzing. So I think that one takeaway that I want you to take from this session is that before, determining the kind of questions that you should be asking your students, you need to determine your learning objectives, and you need to use this Bloom's taxonomy to decide where you want your students to reach, and select out the appropriate verbs and then plan your questions accordingly. And then always keep referring to like where do you want your students to be. Either you want them to be at lower levels of thinking skills, or you want them to achieve higher order thinking skills. And then constantly reflect on the kind of questions that you are asking as well. So if there are like, no questions from here, then we can conclude. I have like added some links which you can go through. I can share the slides. The slides can be shared with you. So there are some links at the end of my presentation which you can open up, and because today we only had 1 hour session, so it was it gets kind of limiting as well. So you can use these links for your further exploration. And thank you so much. Thank you so much for being such a wonderful audience and contributing so much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.